The early 1340s, along the trade routes of Central Asia, a disease began spreading among rodent populations. It would soon become the deadliest pandemic recorded in human history, known today as the Black Death. Modern genetic research has traced the origins of this strain to Central Asia, near the borders of modern Kyrgyzstan and China. From here, the disease spread along the Silk Road, carried by fleas living on black rats traveling with merchant caravans. The disease eventually reached the Genoese trading port of Kaffa on the Black Sea around 1346, during a Mongol siege. Accounts claim the Mongol army catapulted infected corpses over city walls, a deliberate attempt to spread the illness among defenders. Fleeing ships carried the disease into Mediterranean ports, with Sicily recording some of Europe's first cases in October 1347. The disease spread across Europe with a speed that terrified observers, who had no scientific understanding of the mortality. Within 2 years, the Great Mortality reached nearly every corner of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This pandemic left behind mortality on a scale that would permanently reshape the structures of the medieval world. Trade networks inadvertently provided the perfect transmission pathway for a biological mechanism not understood for centuries. The fleas on rats, stowing away on merchant vessels, carried a plague that changed history forever. For centuries following the initial outbreak, the actual biological cause of the Black Death remained genuinely unknown, understood by contemporary medieval physicians through frameworks that modern medical science has since thoroughly revised. Modern genetic and microbiological research has since provided considerably clearer scientific understanding of exactly what caused this devastating pandemic. The disease responsible for the Black Death is now definitively identified as Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that continues to exist today. Though modern antibiotic treatment has made contemporary plague outbreaks, when they do occasionally occur, considerably more manageable than the uncontrolled medieval pandemic. This bacterium primarily circulates among rodent populations, transmitted between animals, and occasionally to humans, through the bite of infected fleas. With black rats serving as a particularly significant reservoir host during the medieval pandemic, given their close proximity to human settlements and trade networks. Genetic analysis of DNA extracted from confirmed medieval plague burial sites, published in several significant scientific studies over the past 2 decades, has definitively confirmed Yersinia pestis as the causative agent of the medieval Black Death, resolving earlier historical debate. The disease could manifest in several distinct clinical forms, with bubonic plague, characterized by painful swollen lymph nodes known as buboes. Pneumonic plague, a more severe variant affecting the lungs directly and capable of spreading through respiratory transmission between infected individuals. Septicemic plague, affecting the bloodstream directly, represented additional, generally more rapidly fatal forms of the same underlying bacterial infection. Historians believe all 3 forms likely contributed to the overall medieval mortality, though bubonic plague's flea-borne transmission likely explains much of the spread pattern. The role of the black rat in facilitating this transmission chain deserves particular attention, since these rodents thrived in close proximity to human settlements. When infected fleas' rodent hosts died in large numbers, surviving fleas, driven by biological necessity to find a new blood source, would transfer to nearby humans. This created the direct transmission pathway responsible for the vast majority of documented medieval plague infections. Contemporary medieval accounts of Black Death symptoms, while understandably lacking modern medical terminology and clinical precision, provide historians with genuinely detailed documentation of the disease's terrifying and rapid physical progression. The most commonly documented and visually distinctive symptom involve the appearance of painful, swollen lymph nodes, typically appearing in the groin, armpit, or neck, which medieval writers described using the term buboes, ultimately giving the bubonic form of the disease its modern scientific name. These swellings, according to numerous surviving contemporary accounts, could grow to considerable size and were frequently accompanied by intense pain, alongside high fever, chills, and severe fatigue that rapidly incapacitated affected individuals. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, whose famous work The Decameron includes a detailed contemporary description of the plague's arrival in Florence, described victims sometimes also developing dark blotches on their skin, likely caused by subcutaneous bleeding associated with the infection's severe progression. A symptom some later historians and writers connected to the eventual popular term Black Death, though it is worth noting this specific term did not actually come into common historical usage until several centuries after the pandemic itself, with contemporary medieval writers instead generally using terms translating more directly to great mortality, or simply the plague. Perhaps most genuinely terrifying to contemporary observers was the disease's remarkably rapid progression, with numerous surviving accounts describing apparently healthy individuals succumbing to death within a matter of days, or in cases of the more severe pneumonic or septicemic forms, sometimes within 24 hours, of initial symptom onset. This terrifyingly compressed timeline between apparent health and death, historians note, contributed significantly to the genuine social panic and breakdown of normal community structures that accompanied the disease's spread through medieval communities, since neighbors, family members, and even attending physicians frequently had little practical time to respond before succumbing to infection themselves. Boccaccio's account, along with numerous other surviving contemporary chronicles, describes the profound social disruption this rapid mortality produced, with normal bonds of family obligation and community support genuinely breaking down under the sheer weight of overwhelming, ever-present death. Several surviving accounts describe family members abandoning sick relatives out of genuine fear of infection, church burial rites becoming increasingly hurried and simplified given the sheer volume of deceased requiring interment, and entire communities experiencing a genuine, documented collapse of ordinary social routine and mutual obligation that contemporary observers found almost as disturbing and noteworthy as the disease's direct physical toll itself. Following its initial European arrival in Sicily during October 1347, the Black Death spread across the continent with a speed and thoroughness that left few regions entirely untouched by its devastating effects over the following several years. The disease reached major population centers including Florence, Venice, and Paris by 1348, with historians studying surviving municipal and church records documenting genuinely catastrophic mortality rates in these densely populated urban centers, where crowded living conditions and limited sanitation infrastructure created circumstances particularly conducive to rapid disease transmission. England experienced significant outbreak beginning in 1348, with the disease eventually reaching as far north as Scandinavia and as far east as Russia by the early 1350s, demonstrating the pandemic's genuinely continental scope across nearly the entirety of medieval Europe. Trade routes and major waterways served as primary transmission corridors, with historians studying the disease's documented geographic spread, noting a clear pattern following established medieval commercial networks, since the same ships, wagons, and trade caravans carrying legitimate commercial goods also inadvertently carried infected fleas and rats between communities. Coastal and river port cities, given their central role in this extensive medieval trade network, frequently experienced the pandemic's earliest regional outbreaks. Mortality estimates for this initial pandemic vary considerably by region and remain subject to genuine ongoing scholarly debate, since comprehensive medieval population records simply do not exist for most affected areas. However, historians broadly agree the pandemic likely killed somewhere between 30% and 50% of Europe's total population within this initial outbreak, representing mortality on a scale that had no genuine precedent in recorded European history, and that would not be approached again by any subsequent European epidemic prior to the modern era. Some regions experienced genuinely catastrophic mortality even beyond these broader continental averages, with certain monasteries, given their communal living arrangements and religious obligation to continue caring for the sick, despite obvious personal risk, recording mortality rates approaching or, in some documented cases, exceeding 60% of their resident population. Conversely, some historians have identified certain more isolated rural communities that appear to have experienced comparatively lower mortality, likely reflecting reduced exposure to the trade route-based transmission patterns that drove much of the pandemic's broader continental spread. Lacking any genuine scientific understanding of bacterial disease transmission, medieval society developed various explanatory frameworks attempting to understand the pandemic's devastating and seemingly indiscriminate mortality. Some were rooted in contemporary medical theory, others in religious interpretation, and tragically, some resulting in historical atrocity directed against specific minority communities. The dominant contemporary medical theory, known as miasma theory, held that disease spread through corrupted or bad air. This was often associated with foul smells, decaying matter, or unfavorable astrological conditions. While scientifically incorrect, this theory did lead some medieval authorities toward genuinely reasonable practical responses, including efforts to improve urban sanitation. They sought to reduce visible sources of decay and foul odor within crowded cities, even though the actual transmission mechanism remained entirely unknown. Religious interpretation played a significant role, with many contemporary accounts describing the disease as divine punishment for collective human sin. Responses included increased devotion, elaborate public penitential processions, and, in some cases, the emergence of flagellant movements. Groups of individuals publicly whipped themselves as an act of religious penance believed capable of appeasing divine anger and halting the pandemic's spread. Most tragically, the pandemic's incomprehensible mortality led to violent persecution of Jewish communities in numerous documented instances across Europe. These were based on false and malicious accusations that Jewish people had deliberately caused the pandemic by poisoning wells and water supplies. These persecutions, documented through historical records, resulted in the destruction of numerous communities and considerable loss of life. This represents a genuine historical atrocity that responsible historical accounts must address directly to fully understand this period of history. It is worth noting that some authorities, including Pope Clement VI, formally condemned these persecutions and rejected the accusations as false. He pointed out that Jewish communities were suffering plague mortality alongside their Christian neighbors, making the poisoning accusations self-evidently implausible. Despite these formal condemnations, historical records confirm such persecutions continued across numerous affected regions. This demonstrates how genuine fear and social panic during a catastrophic event could override both evident logic and formal religious authority. Medieval physicians, working entirely without modern understanding of bacterial infection or antibiotic treatment, developed various treatment approaches for plague victims. Most of these approaches, based on modern medical understanding, offer genuinely limited practical effectiveness against the actual underlying bacterial infection. Common medieval treatments included bloodletting, a widely practiced medical intervention believed capable of restoring proper bodily balance according to prevailing medical theory. Along with various herbal remedies, some cases involve the physical lancing of buboes to drain what physicians believe to be corrupted bodily fluid. Modern medical historians generally conclude most offered little genuine therapeutic benefit, though certain herbal preparations may have provided modest symptomatic relief. The distinctive image of the plague doctor, wearing a beaked leather mask filled with aromatic herbs, represents a recognizable image associated with the pandemic. However, this costume actually developed later, primarily during 17th century outbreaks, rather than during the original 14th century Black Death pandemic. Public health responses included practical measures that, even without correct disease understanding, likely provided meaningful benefit in slowing transmission. Venice notably implemented an extended isolation period for arriving ships and their crews, a practice that gave rise to the modern term, quarantine. Derived from the Italian words for a 40-day isolation, this measure would eventually influence public health practice for centuries to come. Some physicians recommended avoiding crowded areas and maintaining personal hygiene. advice that offered modest practical benefit in reducing individual exposure risk. Even without correct theoretical understanding, accumulated practical observation could occasionally produce genuinely useful public health guidance. Beyond its immediate devastating mortality, the Black Death produced profound and genuinely lasting economic, social, and political transformations. Historians continue studying these as among the most significant consequences of the entire pandemic. The pandemic's massive mortality created a severe and immediate labor shortage across affected regions. Surviving workers suddenly found themselves in considerably greater demand relative to available agricultural and craft labor positions. This shift gave surviving peasants genuinely unprecedented negotiating leverage regarding wages and working conditions. Historians identify this as a factor toward the gradual decline of the traditional feudal labor system across subsequent centuries. This shifting dynamic contributed directly to several notable social uprisings in the decades immediately following the pandemic. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw laborers emboldened by their newly improved economic position. They were frustrated by attempts from landowning authorities to legally suppress rising wages and enforce traditional feudal obligations. They rose in significant organized rebellion against what they perceived as unjust attempts to restrict their post-plague economic circumstances. The pandemic also produced significant religious consequences, with the Catholic Church's inability to provide effective protection against the disease. This contributed to an erosion of unquestioned religious authority, a factor toward broader questioning and eventual reform movements. Agricultural land use patterns shifted, as reduced population pressure led some regions to transition from grain cultivation toward livestock grazing. This lasting transformation in medieval European land use and economic organization persisted well beyond the immediate pandemic period. Wage data from surviving medieval records provides historians with concrete quantitative evidence of this significant economic transformation. Documented agricultural wages rose substantially, despite contemporary legal attempts like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351. The failure of these legal wage suppression efforts illustrates the fundamental economic leverage the reduced labor supply provided to surviving workers. Establishing precise Black Death mortality figures represents a genuinely significant historical challenge, since comprehensive medieval population records simply do not exist for most affected regions, forcing historians to rely on various indirect evidence sources to construct reasonable estimated mortality figures. Historians studying available evidence, including surviving tax records, church burial registers, and archaeological analysis of mass burial sites, generally estimate the initial pandemic wave. Killed between 30% and 50% of Europe's total population between 1347 and 1351, representing a death toll of 75 to 200 million people, though it is worth stating clearly that precise figures remain genuinely uncertain, given the significant limitations in available medieval demographic evidence. Archaeological excavation of mass burial sites, including the East Smithfield Burial Ground in London, has provided direct physical evidence confirming the scale of mortality. These mass graves revealing careful, if hurried, burial practices suggest medieval authorities generally attempted to maintain organized, dignified burial practice even amid overwhelming mortality. Regional mortality variation was significant, with some communities experiencing higher rates based on population density and trade route proximity. Historians speculate potentially genuine differences in local rat and flea population dynamics that remain difficult to fully reconstruct through available evidence. Certain more isolated communities appear to have experienced lower mortality rates, likely due to reduced exposure to the primary trade route-based transmission patterns. Europe's overall population would not fully recover to pre-pandemic levels for well over a century following the initial outbreak. A striking testament to the scale of this catastrophic event, particularly considering the recurring subsequent plague outbreaks that continued periodically through this recovery period. The initial devastating pandemic wave of 1347 to 1351, while representing the Black Death's most severe and historically significant outbreak, did not represent an isolated historical event, with subsequent plague outbreaks continuing to affect European populations periodically across the following several centuries. Historians studying this extended pandemic period, sometimes referred to as the Second Plague Pandemic, to distinguish it from earlier and later historical plague outbreaks, document recurring regional plague outbreaks occurring approximately every decade or two across various parts of Europe throughout the remainder of the 14th century, and well into subsequent centuries, with some notable outbreaks, including the significant Great Plague of London in 1665, occurring more than 3 centuries after the initial 14th century pandemic wave. These recurring outbreaks, while individually generally less catastrophic than the initial pandemic, nonetheless maintained plague as a genuine, persistent public health concern across Europe for centuries, shaping ongoing public health policy development, including continued refinement of quarantine practices and gradually improving general urban sanitation infrastructure, motivated by accumulated experience managing recurring plague outbreaks. Across many successive generations, the plague's ultimate decline across Europe during the following centuries remains a subject of genuine ongoing historical and scientific investigation, with proposed contributing factors including gradual improvements in urban sanitation, potential changes in rat population dynamics and species distribution, and possibly evolving immunity patterns within affected human populations, though historians generally caution against attributing this gradual decline to any single definitive cause, given the genuinely complex, multifaceted nature of the pandemic's eventual, gradual retreat from its position as Europe's most persistent and feared recurring public health threat. The Great Plague of London in 1665, representing one of the final major outbreaks of this extended second pandemic period within England specifically, killed an estimated 100,000 people within the city over the course of roughly 18 months, demonstrating that even after more than 3 centuries of accumulated experience managing recurring plague outbreaks, the disease retained genuine capacity for devastating, concentrated urban mortality whenever conditions proved favorable. More than 6.5 centuries after its initial devastating outbreak, the Black Death continues offering genuinely significant historical and scientific insight. Modern researchers continue to study this pandemic using increasingly sophisticated scientific tools, unavailable to previous generations of historians. Modern genetic sequencing technology has allowed researchers to extract and analyze Yersinia pestis DNA directly from confirmed medieval plague victims' remains. This provides definitive scientific confirmation of the pandemic's biological cause, while offering insight into the specific genetic characteristics of the medieval pandemic strain. Modern plague variants, thanks to contemporary antibiotic treatment, no longer pose anything approaching the catastrophic mortality risk of the uncontrolled medieval outbreak. This continued research also offers broader insight into pandemic disease dynamics, including how trade networks and population density influence transmission patterns. We see how societies respond to public health crises and how misunderstanding of disease causation can contribute to devastating social consequences. The Black Death's demographic and economic consequences remind us that pandemic disease represents far more than simply a medical phenomenon. It was a genuine historical force capable of reshaping fundamental social and economic structures across an entire continent for generations. Standing today with modern medical understanding, it becomes possible to view the Black Death not merely as a tragedy, but as a significant case study. This insight has continued proving genuinely relevant across subsequent centuries of human history, including our own.